Hello, everyone. So as I promised, I'm going to do a very short video here, finish off our CSS section. It's likely that sometime in the week I will do another short video in the order of 30 to 40 minutes to introduce JavaScript, just so we don't fall too far behind for our next assignment. And since we're missing a whole week, essentially, of classes. So I'll post a couple of videos in this playlist. So this video is only going to be about CSS. We're going to finish off our CSS section. Essentially, in Friday's class, we talked about everything that we need for the upcoming assignment one. So what I just want to do here is give you an idea of other ways that we can stylize our page, talk a little bit about what floating is, what tables or how to stylize tables. And then I'll give you a very short introduction on CSS frameworks. All right, so let's just dive right into this because we were I kind of skipped over a couple of sections in the last class. So I want to go back and talk about those. So you see here that we have three sections actually towards the end that we skipped over. There was a section on floating elements. There was a section on styling the tables, as well as CSS framework. So I want to go back and talk about those things, and that will kind of end off our discussion on CSS. Okay, so floating elements. So this is where I want you to think back to where we were talking about before about positioning. And in terms of what I said about positioning, I said at the time that don't use position whenever you can. Okay, so instead, if you do need to shift things around, I would highly recommend that you use a float instead if possible. Okay, so there's very few looks that you cannot really achieve without floating, with floating elements. So I would invite you to use that instead of position. Now, as I said in the class, there are situations when we do need to use position. So, but use it sparingly. Okay. So, how does floating work? Well, let's go back to what we talked about before. So this is our paragraph. So if you can imagine that right now we have our paragraph here. We added some space. I believe it was 10 or 50 pixels, um, top and bottom of both of our paragraphs. And then we gave it a height, and this is what you see here. Now, let's say that the intent is that I want to have the paragraphs next to each other. Okay, so I want them next to each other. And in fact, what I want is all the other elements on the page to kind of shift around it so that it kind of avoids the paragraph. All right, so this is achieved by what we call a float property. So we can use a float property to do this. And let's go back to our code. In fact, let's take a look at our index.html one more time. This code is what you currently have online. But after this demo, I will also upload this code as well. All right, so you see two paragraphs here. One of them is labeled blue. I want to very quickly go back and let's get rid of some of these attributes because I don't want those to be applied to all of them. Sorry, I'm just looking for where my P is. So where did I put my paragraph? Um, oh, here we go. Sorry, I was staring at it. All right, so we have width and height. So let's say I get rid of height, and let's say I make width, let's say 25% or 25. Yeah, this essentially works out to be 25% of the viewport width. All right, so I'm going to keep the background. I'll keep the colors. And for the margins, I will actually bump up the margins a little bit to 20 and 20 here. All right, so let's see what we have so far. Okay, so this is what I want. All right, so you see we have two paragraphs here. You can see that there's margins around. and there's margins around both paragraphs, and they're in the form that we want. All right, so as I said, the intent here is that I want to move this paragraph alongside of this other paragraph. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is use a float property, and I'm going to apply that to both of these paragraphs. Now, what the float property says is that I'm going to grab the element off of the page. Okay, so if you remember our discussion on absolute positioning, it's very much like absolute positioning. We grab the element out of the page and it's almost like it's not there at all. Okay, so it prints it as if it's not there at all. Except what float does is it then puts it back into its regular position, and then all of the other elements have to shift around in order to avoid it. All right, so if I shift both of these, sorry, if I float both of these paragraphs to the left, then that means we're going to grab both of these paragraphs and remove it from the page. This next aside is then going to be shifted up. And then when we put the paragraphs back in, it's going, the aside will have to shift in order to avoid it. So it's not enough to talk about it. We'll just actually put that in. So let's say that we do something like float left for both of these paragraphs. All right, so if we do float left, this is exactly what I was talking about. So we have a paragraph, which is floated left, floated left. You see that the rest of this, right? So if I hover over this, you'll see that to um, the aside, to the aside tag, it's as if nothing was there, okay? Except when we put these back in, when we put these paragraphs back in, all the content of the aside will have to shift over to kind of avoid it. Okay, so I hope you see exactly what's happening here. So you can see that the margins here have also been applied to the paragraph. Okay, this also made this image shift over, right? So we had the relative position. That means that the image was supposed to be right around here, and it's now been shifted down here. Okay, so that's what you're seeing here. All right, so if we were to use a float, and we would say, okay, good, we have all of these items kind of floated next to each other. And by the way, the extra uh, the, the extra, I guess, constraint for a float is that when we resize, you'll notice that if we ever run out of room for resizing, and I can't show you this here, unfortunately, that it will automatically jump depending on the location, right? So for example, if I had made this width, the width of the paragraph, a particular set width, a pixel, uh, and we run out of those pixels, the other paragraph, the paragraph next to it, will automatically jump down to avoid it. Okay, so there's a set algorithm in the float to allow us to be able to dynamically shift in that way. Okay, so this is built into CSS. All right, so let's say that I have this aside, and I don't really want the aside to be next to these paragraphs. I just want these two paragraphs to be floated next to each other, but I actually want this aside to be back in its regular position down here. So what I can do is I can add to the aside, I can add one extra parameter. So let's just call this, I'll just say float. All right, I'll just label this as float. Yeah. All right, so label this as float, and then what we're going to have to do with the aside is that I'm going to have to add a clear attribute, a clear property for left. So this says whenever there's an aside element on the left side, I want to clear it of everything that is floated. So I don't want any floated elements to the left of the aside. Okay, so that just says I don't ever want this aside to be shifted because of any reason. So let's go back to here. If we refresh, you'll see that the aside is now jumped down after these floated items. Okay, so that's really all you have to know about float. And with these two tools, I would probably say we can achieve most of the looks that we're doing in general. Okay, so play around with that. And again, as I said, we don't really have time to go through every single attribute here. I did post the slides. So the slides go into a lot of detail about how to do very specific things. So read through that. We won't do that for any other language. It's just HTML, CSS. I believe there's just so much stuff to do, and they're very specific. So I'm just giving you the general ideas and allow you to play around with it. Okay, but there's float and there's clear. All right, next. So we talked about floating elements. Let's talk a little bit about styling tables. All right, so a table we mentioned before looks something like this. Okay, so this is our table here. Okay, in fact, I'm going to go to our CSS and give the table a little bit of room. Okay, so I'm going to label this section as table. And I will just grab the whole table here in the selector, and let's give it some margin. So I'll give it like 50 pixels above and 50 pixels below. Okay. There is a shorthand for this. So if I only have two, if I only have this, right, this will achieve the same thing. Okay. So you see we have the top and bottom now with 50 pixels, and then the two sides with 0. All right, so this is our table right now. And what I first want to do is give it a border. So just to show you by default what a table looks like, because right now it's all blank. The font is as it is. So I'm just going to give a border 1 pixel solid black so that we can see exactly where that is. And now in addition to this, we'll see that in our table, if I scroll down a little bit, our table has table headers and table datas. Okay, so in fact, let me add a few more table datas in here just to give us a little bit more room to work with, and maybe even one more table row. And we're going to add a few more, some styling to it. All right, so we're going to add the styling to both the table headers and the table datas. All right, so we'll do table headers and table datas. I want to apply this to it. So I want to do a border and then 1 pixel solid black. Let's do blue so that we can see the difference. Okay, so now I don't know if you can see this, but on the outside, we have a black border. And then in the middle, with all the table headers and all the table datas, we have blue individual outlines. So what this tells you is by default, there's a little bit of room that is applied between the table itself and the rows. Okay, so every row has actually a little bit of a room applied to it. And this is actually the margin. So in order to get rid of this room in between the table and the cells, if we don't want that room, there is a property in table called a table collapse. Is it called table collapse? Probably not called table collapse. Border collapse. Border collapse. All right, and I'm going to assign this as collapse. Okay, so by default, it is separated. Okay, and now I'm going to collapse the table. And I'm going to make this one black. Okay, and you'll see that the collapse will get rid of the space in between. All right, so here's where we can play around a little bit. We can actually do something like if I have the table datas, I can do whenever I have a table data, and the table data is the nth child, and then we do 2n minus, all right, let's do 2n. Okay. So this is an equation for even numbers. Okay, so essentially it is saying for all the even numbers, and we can actually do 3n or 4n or whatever, right? So for all the even numbers of the table datas, I want to apply a background color. So let's do a background color of Alice blue. And I really like this Alice blue color, so you'll see this a lot. So now you can see that, oh, what have I done? Oh, table data, table row. Let's do table row. That's, yeah. Well, you saw table data there. Okay, so the table data, yeah, the second table data, we actually had all the blues. But what I intended was I wanted to highlight these ones, right? So now I highlight the all the even rows of the table, right? So perhaps maybe that's the look that you want. Um, what else do I want to say? I mean, the other thing that I talked about before, and I haven't added it to the HTML file. If you remember our discussion on call group, right, and the COL uh, tag for the columns, right? So at the beginning of our table, we can actually define a call group to say that I have a bunch of columns, and then in the nth column, second column, third column, I want to call that column a particular ID or a class, right? So if you remember that discussion, at the time I said you can use that in order to stylize certain columns, right? So notice right now, there's just really no way to stylize a column, right? So we can apply a style to a column in this way. Okay, so that's basically how we deal with a table. All right, so I think we're good here. So if there are any questions, by the way, please feel free to post them on Discord. I try to check Discord as much as possible, but I've seen that a lot of you are responding to each other, which is really good. That's really the purpose of why I wanted it there in the first place. So so yeah, if you have any questions, please post it there. Also, feel free to email me with any questions as well. So the last thing I want to talk about in this section is about CSS frameworks. CSS framework, there are several of them, and a lot of them will call themselves CSS frameworks. The most, I would probably say, the most famous of which is called Sass, right? Uh, so maybe some of you have used other ones, but essentially what these types of frameworks do is it's almost like a higher level language. Okay, so it's a language that is in CSS. We can write a CSS language, but what we have to do is process it. So we actually have to send in this file, and we have to compile it, right? That means like read the code and then turn it into valid CSS, right? So you may have noticed that some of the things that we're doing in CSS is rather difficult, or like it's a little bit tedious to write out. So um, so that's basically what CSS frameworks are used for. Now, you may have heard of a CSS library called Bootstrap. And I've actually included that description in the CSS frameworks. We're probably not going to spend too much time talking about CSS frameworks in this class, but I would probably classify Bootstrap as a library instead of a framework. Okay, so a framework is usually one that is written in some other high level, and you need to compile it and then turn it into some template code. Whereas a library is something you can just use right out of the box, and Bootstrap is something you can use right out of the box, right? So anyways, we're kind of talking about semantics here, but let's do a very quick example, and let's work with what should we work with here? All right, so let's deal with Bootstrap. So Bootstrap, the idea is that whenever we have a page, like we're looking at a browser window, we're dividing it into 12 sections. Okay, now there's a reason behind 12. 12 is just not a number that somebody picked out. It is, psychologically, 12 is a significant number because this is a good number for our eyes to be able to work with. And our eyes is able to section out certain columns when we just visualize a page. So I invite you, go to any page, go to any web page, and you can take a look at that page, and you can pretty much work out that there are certain columns associated with that page. So I'm looking at W3 schools right now, for example, and W3 schools usually has three main columns. So the first, the column that's on the left-hand side is all of the navigation, right? So HTML and CSS and JavaScript, all of the subcategories are typically there. The main content is in the middle, right, which takes up one big column. And then there's another column usually on the side for links or advertisements or something like that, right? So, so that's a typical layout for a lot of pages out there. So in Bootstrap, it does uh, kind of the same thing. It allows you to be able to divide a page or a section into several columns. So the first thing that we'll have to do is jump over to Bootstrap. Okay, so this is the getbootstrap.com website. So we can, if we wanted to quickly get started with Bootstrap, there's an include via CDN. Okay, so I talked about what CDN is in week one. It's essentially a server that allows us to be able to very quickly grab media or anything like that. Here, we're grabbing the code for CSS. So we're going to come into our HTML file, and at the very top, when we had a link, so after this link, I'm going to paste in this link to grab the bootstrap. So notice that we're grabbing it from a URL. So instead of grabbing it from style.css, which is a file, we're grabbing it somewhere on the web, which we're allowed to do. Okay, so now we've just imported all of the functionalities of Bootstrap. And what Bootstrap does is it relies on special names for classes. Okay, special names for classes. So as an example, I can name this class equal to, there's this thing called Jumbotron. Okay, so we'll take a look at what Jumbotron looks like in 1 second. So I've labeled this header as a Jumbotron. Another thing I'm going to do is come down to table, and I'm going to label this as class is equal to table. So table is another keyword that is used by Bootstrap just to indicate that I want you to apply a specific look to that table. Now, these looks are default by Bootstrap. Okay, so you may have noticed that some of these looks are very boring, right? So, so when if I don't want to spend all my time stylizing a table and everything like that, you can just let Bootstrap do it, right? So the disadvantage of using something like Bootstrap is that you really don't have a lot of say sometimes in the details, okay? Or it's kind of a hacky thing to kind of play around with the styles. Okay, so that's one of the disadvantages. It kind of complicates your code a little bit, but also you're at the mercy of what they think is a good, a good style. One more thing that I'm going to do here is that I'm going to put a div here. And again, I said never use a div, but here I am going to. So I'm going to put a div here, and my div, I'm going to label it as class called row. All right, so I'm going to put the div after the p variable. So right now I'm applying this row attribute to two of my paragraphs. And in the main, I'm also going to create a class called container. Now, these are all keywords from Bootstrap. And if you want to take a look at other ways that you can do certain things, then take a look at the Bootstrap reference. There's a lot of different examples on how to do certain things. Now, instead of this class blue, I'm going to make both of these paragraphs well, okay, I'm going to make the first paragraph column medium 2. So this is a special labeling for Bootstrap. Column says I want to define this paragraph as one of the columns. MD means medium, so I want to make it a medium looking column, and I want to apply the size 2 to it. Okay, so I'll show you in a second what size 2 means, but I'm going to apply the same thing here. So class is equal to column, and then medium, and then this time I'm going to apply the size 4. And you're going to see the difference between these two paragraphs. All right, so let me go back to our document. Okay, so remember that I've applied three things. Whoops. I've applied three things. I've applied logo, I've applied the paragraph, and I also applied to this table here. So let's refresh and let's take a look. So you notice that this Jumbotron has now it kind of looks like this, right? So it gives you some big kind of content here. I'm not sure if you can really tell the difference, but it changes the font at the very least. The main content now, so you see that we have main content. We've actually changed the fonts. Now, if you notice that we had some style applied to the paragraphs. So those styles have actually been overwritten. Um, and you'll notice that this main content is by default, it has a little bit of padding. Sorry, margin? Either margin or padding, I don't remember that it's being applied here. You'll also notice that this column, the first paragraph that we wrote, is a little bit thinner than the second. So you can imagine that all the way across we have 12 columns. So right now we're taking up 2 columns for this paragraph, and we're taking up 4 columns for this paragraph. So you see the rest of the room here takes up the rest of the 12. Okay, so if we do something like let's do 10 here. Okay, so we're going to see where all of the columns are. Okay, so you'll notice that this paragraph, this column, right, is taken up here, and then this is the rest of it. This is 10. Okay, so this is our 2 columns, this is our 10 columns. And the thing about Bootstrap is if we decide to kind of reshape our window, notice that at some point these two paragraphs are going to be top and bottom. Okay, so when we run out of room, it will automatically make that adjustment. So uh, there's the types of columns that we can have are small, medium, large. I think there's an extra large as well. And this just indicates at which point do I want to shift from 2 columns to side by side to up and down, right? So this is all things that we can adjust. Now, we're limited in the things that we can do, right? We're limited by those 4 categories, right? Small, medium, large. So if we wanted to shift at some particular pixel, right, amount of pixels, then we cannot actually do that, right? So it's at least it's very difficult to do that under Bootstrap. And that's one of the reasons why I said in the first assignment, try not to use Bootstrap. All right, in the next few assignments, I will let you use Bootstrap. It's not going to be a requirement, but it does make things a lot easier, right? So if you're able to grasp this concept, and it's a lot easier to look up how to do certain things and how to get certain looks, right? So you may have noticed that vanilla CSS is not that great to deal with. Okay, so I think that's really all I wanted to talk about for Bootstrap. I will do several more examples of Bootstrap as we go forward. Okay, so, oh, I think we forgot to look at the table. So let's go to the bottom. So you'll notice that the table also now has a very nice kind of nice attribute or nice look applied to it, nice style applied to it. So play around with that. There's a lot of things we can do with tables, a lot of things we can do with forms, with buttons, with text, right? There's a lot of these things that is built into Bootstrap that allows us to be able to just through classes alter the looks. So yeah, if you want to play around with that, definitely play around with that. I highly recommend it, especially when it gets time to do our final project, because there's several pages that we have to make, and you don't want to fiddle around with CSS, just shifting a little bit. You just want to let Bootstrap handle it, right? So again, it's not a requirement, right? So if you feel, oh, you know what, I'm very comfortable with CSS, I don't need to learn this other library, that's fine as well. Okay. All right. Now, the final thing I wanted to look at here is I'm going to, uh, let's see here. Let's see if I can do something interesting. So I'm going to go back to the style and I'm going to add a little bit to the image. Okay, so this is the image tag. And here I want to talk a little bit about transitions. Okay, so let's say when I hover over the image, I want the image. So right now, when I hover over the image, nothing happens, okay, except the title comes up. But when I hover over the image, I want the image to have a little bit larger of a width. So I'm going to do width, and then I'm going to make it 150%. Okay, and make it 150% of the width, and then I could apply a height as well. Um, but but here I just want to apply a transition to it. Now, in a transition, there's actually a lot of different ways that we can specify a transition. Um, the first thing that we need to identify is what are we applying this to? Okay, so we know that when we hover over something, that the width is going to change. It's going to change to 150%. So I want the transition to happen in a span of 1 second. Okay, so the next parameter here is how many seconds does it take for that transition to take place. Now, by default, it's instantaneous. Okay, so if we left out the transition, you may have seen it several times. When we hover over something, then the transition happens instantaneously, right? So here, what we want to do is we want to apply the transition of 1 second. So if I do a refresh here and I hover over, oh, wow, that's not what I wanted. Um, okay, let's not do. I think 150% was applied to the parent. So let's instead do 200 pixels. I wonder how that's gonna look. Right. So I'm not sure if the transition was even applied there. So let's take a look here. Oh, there's no transition. Okay, let's see. Let me figure out what is happening here. Um, all right. So sorry, let me pause the video for a second here. Okay, never mind. I forgot something. Um, okay, so initially we had an image that was here, right? So what we have to do is give it a width to start with. So I'm going to give it a width initially of, we had 200 pixels. So let's give it the width of 150 pixels. And it's here that I need to apply the transition property. So transition, and I'm going to transition for the width for 1 second. All right. So when we hover over it, okay, so now if we apply it, hopefully this will work. All right, so there you go. We're going to change the width, and by default, changing the width also changes the height because we haven't applied the height property, right? So as we hover over it, you'll notice that transition happens for 1 second, right, until it gets to the final the final outcome. Okay. All right, so that's basically how we do transitions in CSS. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to talk about. I'm not sure how long this video is going to be, but have a look at them, and most importantly, play around with these properties. There's a lot of tutorials online on how to do these specific things. So if you're ever stuck, you can always Google it. Uh, and yeah, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we do different demos. We're definitely going to apply styles to different things. So be in the habit of, changing the different styles, thinking about if I want to shift this item to this, if I want to make a different color, if I want to make it a different transition, what is the code that is associated with that? That's probably the best way to pick up CSS at this point. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop the recording here, and I will see you in the next video when we talk about JavaScript.